welcome to the history portion of this cannabis class. In this module, we are going to be looking at the origins of the cannabis plant, where it actually came from, and then we'll kind of trace its journey around the globe, which really follows human journey around the globe. As humans spread around the globe, also cannabis went with it. So how we figure out the origins of plants is we look at the soil layers and we look for little bits of pollen in there, and we also look at for some fossils of maybe plants, maybe some of the leaves and things like that. So what the archaeologists have done is they've gone into the layers of soil and they've looked particularly for pollen that matches what we know of cannabis today. And what they have found out is cannabis and humulus, which is the hops plant, a well-known plant that's used today in the beer industry. And those two are in the same family. And it seems to have diverged, cannabis seems to have diverged from the hops plant. So they sort of became different species within the same family somewhere around 28 million years ago. So that was a long time ago, before we had humans kind of roaming around here. So this plant has been with us for a very, very long time. It has been on the earth. It's pretty fascinating to look into how they did that. And the cannabis plant actually is really interesting because it's not just a plant that's been on the earth, it's a plant that humans have used for, it seems like, since humans started interacting with plants and using the plants. So it's a pretty fascinating history. By looking at those, the fossils, but mostly the pollen layers in the soil, they have traced the origin of cannabis back to kind of what's now Southeast Asia, like Northwest India, that kind of area. So that's where we're looking at as the origin. And you can see on this map here, we've got those hatched portions where it kind of shows where it started and then how it spread around the world. So we now know that evidence of the plant in areas that are now known as like the Ukraine, Bulgaria, that Mediterranean coast. We do have evidence that the plant had traveled to those areas from about 9,000 years ago. So I know that's a big gap. So we don't, it's hard for them to follow little bits of pollen throughout the area, but we can trace it back to its spread to about 9,000 years ago. We do have some early artifacts of cannabis from about 10,000 years ago. One of the earliest artifacts that they've found that has traces of cannabis in it is from Taiwan, and that was on some pottery. And in this pottery, they used hemp rope that was presumably used to help give some structure to the pottery. And so they found some evidence of that about 10,000 years ago. So that's really showing that humans were starting to use the cannabis plant as a tool even that long ago. Cultivated cannabis starts to show up in the Baltic region around 500 before current era. So that was still quite a long time ago. Probably humans were realizing this is such an interesting and useful plant that they thought, well, instead of having to go search for it out in the forests and out in the fields, why don't we just start growing it ourselves? So it is thought to be the first crop that humans started cultivating and purposely growing it near their villages so that they would have easy access to it. There's also evidence of cultivation in Europe during the Copper and the Bronze Ages. And so it's thought, because we kind of have seen about the same age, that evidence of cultivation in different areas of the globe, it's assumed that kind of it sprang up simultaneously. So different communities of humans were realizing, like, hey, we should just plant this stuff and we have easy access to it to our villages. So from there, it started to go around the world as people moved around the world, because, again, such a useful plant, people would bring it with them as they sort of roamed around and settled in different areas. So we do have archaeological evidence of ancient cannabis use in Mongolia and China and Afghanistan and in the Hindu Kush Mountains as well. There's a lot of evidence that it was used as a really important tool and food source for humans. Moved into the kind of Eurasia area. That was around the 12th century current era, so quite a bit later that we found evidence of it kind of moving in as people moved into that kind of European area. And it does tend to follow the trade routes as humans started to spread. As I said before, humans start to spread, they brought that plant with them. Hemp didn't arrive to the Americas until somewhere around the mid-1500s. So Christopher Columbus, he came along, brought that cannabis with him, and we'll talk about that in the next section, a little bit more detail about that. Now I was able to find some evidence that cannabis did grow, some native type of cannabis did grow in North America prior to it being introduced from the Old World through the explorers, but there's not a lot of evidence to kind of show that different species grew here or that some of the Native Americans, the Aboriginals of this continent, were using it. There's a little bit of evidence, but I think we still need to do a lot more research in that area to see how it was used by our Native Americans. So for now, we kind of we think it might have been here, but we don't have good evidence that it was. But once it did make it into, the Spaniards brought it over, started cultivating it in Chile, of South America, and then it did start to spread up into the rest of South America, up into North America. And it's been used as an agricultural product, it's been used as medicine, it's been used as a whole bunch of different tools and stuff, and also social pastime, religious and spiritual purposes as well. So here's a little map that I found. There's some inaccuracies on this map. Of course, we know that it's been around since long before the 1920s, probably more into the the 1800s. It made it up into what is the United States and Canada now. But this gives a little bit of an idea of how some of that spread happened throughout the world. It's interesting to look at. I think this map will probably get changed as we get more information about it. But it kind of gives you kind of a general idea of how it spread. You can see Australia down there didn't get much in the way of trade going in, but we do know that the British did start using Australia to grow cannabis way back. So in North America, we had our first crop in what is now Nova Scotia, and that was a French botanist who started doing that. He is credited with, in 1606, with having the first hemp plantation in Canada, or what is now Canada. And then beginning in 1801, the lieutenant governor of the province of Upper Canada, of course that was before we had full Canada back then, used to give free hemp seeds to anyone who wanted to grow them. So those early settlers in Canada, they were really encouraged to grow the hemp plant, which then we didn't really differentiate between hemp and cannabis, which the way that we do now. Down in the US, George Washington was pretty famous for growing hemp, and he did encourage its cultivation. And it was the first cultivated crop in the United States. And it did remain the largest cash crop up until probably the 1930s, when it became outlawed. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But some states were actually producing up to 40,000 tons. Now, one thing you should know about about George Washington and his plantations, his hemp plantations, is that especially back then, growing hemp is an actually really labor-intensive crop. They didn't have the big machineries that we have now. And hemp is a very fibrous, strong plant. And so even today, anything that's used for wheat cultivation is just not strong enough. Those machineries will kind of get all like bunged up from the fiber from there. So it was all done by hand, of course, back in George Washington's time. And so it was plantation. It was really done the way that they did the sugar and the cotton. It was farmed by slave labor because it was quite labor intensive. Fast forward into our modern trade now, and the illicit cultivation and sale of cannabis has been going on even though it was outlawed. So to me, that really shows us what an important plant this is that people for the last 100 years, or at least the last 90 years that it's been outlawed, people have really been still using this plant even though their liberty was at stake. So they were really taking a risk to grow this plant, but it's so important for society today, and medicinally, of course, that's an important one, that people were willing to put that at risk. Even in BC, so British Columbia, I grew up there, and it was well known through the 70s and the 80s is that cannabis, marijuana as it was known back then, was the biggest export out of British Columbia. And a lot of that was grown in the Kootenay region of BC. And I've had students in other classes that I've taught where they're third and fourth generation families who have been growing cannabis as their profession for quite a few years, for decades really. The biggest trade out of the Kootenays was down into Washington State, how it would get smuggled across the border into there. I think it was around 2015, when cannabis became legal in Washington State, that actually dried up a whole bunch of business within the Kootenays, and these families who had relied on this for several generations, all of a sudden they saw their livelihood kind of dry up because nobody at that point was really willing to risk smuggling it across the border because now it was legal in Washington State. So it's been a big issue for a lot of people, especially in the Kootenay region of British Columbia. And if you look at how cannabis is sort of expanding today, we realize that the Kootenays are kind of a special area of Canada. They kind of have their own little microeconomy there, and they're really leading the way for helping to find ways that these, third and fourth generation cannabis growers have been able to start up new businesses there, even though Health Canada's regulations that we're going to look at in a further section, it has shown that they're trying to get around how can we support these growers without them having to put out millions of dollars to get started with the traditional licensed producer that we have right now. We're going to talk about that a little bit more as we move through this course. So we have this really great map that has been created, and I know it's really hard to kind of see this online, but if you go to the URL that I have there in the bottom right-hand corner, you can get a very large version of this. And we're going to go through some of these different sections of here in our next module, but I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a visual of, this is mostly working on how medicinally cannabis kind of spread around the world, what were the high points, and we're going to touch on those as we go through. But this is a really great resource if you wanted to just kind of remind yourself. You can find a much clearer version of this online. So early cultivation, we talked about how cannabis was the first cultivated crop by humans. We started purposely growing it in fields where it was easily accessible to the community. And because it's used for a couple of different things, if they grew those plants really close together, it would block out the sun from all of them. And so all of those cannabis stalks, or those hemp stalks is what we typically think of as hemp, they grow really tall and skinny, and that's what we want for the fiber of the plant, is we like those big, tall, long fibers that we can get out of it. But if they're growing it more for the resin or for the bud, so for medicinal or spiritual purposes, then those plants were kind of grown further apart in the way that we would see how cannabis is grown today in the big greenhouses. The plants are grown quite far apart, so they have lots of room to grow to get nice and bushy. They have better access to light all around, and then they'll produce those big flowers that have all the resin and the medicinal qualities in them. Okay, so that was a brief look at the origins of cannabis and how it spread throughout the world. Of course, I just touched on some very small highlights. We could probably do a week's worth of kind of analyzing how it moved around the world, but this gives you an idea of how cannabis really has been around with us long before humans were kind of roaming around the earth. And then humans quickly discovered what a great tool this plant was and brought it with them as the settlements kind of happened throughout both the old world, and it was brought with them to the new world. It's always really a good sign of the tools that people brought with them as they settled in new places. It shows how important that was. And cannabis definitely has been an important part of human civilization, probably since the beginning of time.